And now, with wars being waged around the world, not only in Ukraine and Gaza, but Sudan and all over the place, with tens of thousands of people being killed, individual and collective grief have become front and center in all our daily lives. Renowned expert David Kessler argues that a world overwhelmed by constant crises is becoming, quote, grief illiterate. And he's joining Michelle Martin now to explain why it's important to dedicate time to process death in our increasingly desensitized world.
Thanks, Christiane. David Kessler, thanks so much for talking with us once again.
So glad to be with you, Michelle.
You know, you're considered one of the foremost experts on grief and grieving. What are you seeing at the moment? I mean, I know what I'm seeing. I'm seeing, airline disasters, wildfires, floods, an election season that for some people for everybody it was exhausting, but for some people it was traumatic. What are you seeing around the issue that you've worked on for so much of your adult life?
Well, I'm seeing such a tension right now between individual grief and collective grief. There's that saying about put your own oxygen mask on first. Well, the plane feels like it's on fire. So how do we take care of ourselves, hoping to get our grief witnessed and seen by others when they're overwhelmed with so much pain already in the world?
What are you seeing with the people that you're working with?
Mainly who I see individual people who are in our groups, as well as the therapists who are treating people throughout the world. And they're telling me people are coming in feeling like the world doesn't have time for their own pain. That they're dealing with their mother, their father, their spouse, their child, their sibling who died, or a home loss, or all the other things that are happening. And the world is moving so fast and so quickly that your news from last night is old news today.
Can I ask you, maybe I should have asked this first. How do you define grief?
I think of grief as always a change we didn't want. So that means it's obviously about death, but it's also about so many other things, whether it's a home loss, an airplane crash, so many of the disasters, things that happen in the world. Maybe it's how you perceive our government going. There's all these types of grief that all live together in this world, and sometimes in a pretty clunky fashion.
You recently contributed to a piece in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Why We Are Getting Worse at Grieving." Why do you say we're getting worse at grieving?
Well, a lot of what I'm teaching is what our great-grandparents knew, how to take time for their grief. In our modern world, we feel so much pressure to get to the next moment, do the next thing, be so productive. And grief has a much longer shadow. We often think about grief as like the TV episodes we see. Episode 1, someone dies. Episode 2, you deal with it. Episode 3, you get back to life. And grief is much more messy in real life and is much longer.
You have said that we live in a grief illiterate world. Why do you say that, and why do you think that is?
Well, we have sanitized grief and loss and death in our world. There was a time in the 40s when death moved into the hospital, grief moved into the funeral home. Even like if you have a front door that's from a house in the 40s, it's wider because the casket used to be in your front room. And we used to call, if you think about it, your grandparents, great-grandparents may have called it the parlor. And what happened to the parlor? It left the home and it became the funeral parlor. And we said, your front room should not be for the dying. It should be a living room. So we're all about life now. And we feel like it may be bad luck or the evil eye to think about death before we need to. I tell people, unfortunately, the death rate is 100%. It's going to come to all of our world someday, and we prepare for everything except grief.
But don't you, forgive me for asking it this way, but could some of that be just the way our workplaces function? I mean, there are places where you don't have bereavement leave, or if you, maybe it's a day, and it has to be like a close relative, like a mother or a father, or God forbid, a child, but an aunt who may have helped raise you, a grandparent who may have helped raise you, a best friend. That doesn't even qualify. And I just wonder if some of it's just the way it's not understood to be something that you need to take time for. That's private. You do that on your own time.
Well, think about that, because I do a lot of work with organizations and companies. It takes probably over 500 hours to deal with the death of a loved one. And we think, oh, you're going to neatly make a call in your lunch hour. And in the old days, the thought was in the workplace, don't bring your personal life to work. Well, the world has gotten complex when a loved one dies. We've got estates, we've got calls, we've got death certificates, all these things. The funeral doesn't neatly coincide with the death in 3 days for your leave. So all of this in a movement now where we're kind of saying to folks, bring your whole self to work. But wait a minute. Isn't part of the grief my whole self? So there's a lot of work being done now on grief in the workplace, employers trying to figure out how to manage it well and be there. And one of the things I teach companies is we're always talking about employee engagement. When someone has a death, a loss, how you engage with them creates so much loyalty. We remember how our company was there for us when our loved one died or wasn't there for us.
See, I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., where I'm sure you're following this, that the president and his kind of designated representative, Elon Musk, one of the world's richest people, is laying people off. I mean, there are people who are overseas who are doing assignments that they were sent to by our government who are now being told, oh, actually, never mind, come home, take your kids out of school, you don't have a job. I'm just sort of, I am struck by how contrary that is to what people expect from the modern workplace. And yet this is sort of being celebrated in some quarters. But I'm curious, just from your standpoint of a person who is expert in the ways in which human beings function, what do you make of that?
Well, it certainly is going to cause a lot of folks to feel complicated grief. Because on one hand, we have a collective grief that half the country, maybe even more than half, said they wanted changes. And they wanted these changes to come about. And now that the changes are coming about, it's getting more personal. It's affecting people and our lives in ways we didn't think. Oh, I know someone who's lost their job. Are we going to have a post office? And all of that creates so much uncertainty. And grief and uncertainty is a terrible mixture.
Terrible for what?
I think for all of us, because we want safety in our world. We want order. I mean, if anything, grief is disorder. And when we have so much disorder in the world, it's hard for our mind to make sense of it. And so that's kind of also where we started this idea of the mixing of this collective grief that's going on and the individual lives that are being touched, and some of them destroyed and lost, and us trying to find our way. And if you're not affected, you're watching it. And I would think many people are dealing with even what we call vicarious grief and trauma, that you're just seeing so much pain in the world these days. And a lot of us aren't prepared for it. I think certainly the young people are not prepared for this kind of collective grief we're feeling and going into.
And what about these regional disasters that you may have seen on television or on your social media, but you haven't experienced yourself? Like the wildfires in LA, certainly terrifying, but even parts of LA weren't affected. And then you see, before that, we had the floods. There were floods in parts of the South. And there is this ongoing war in Ukraine, started by Russia. it has to be said. And we're seeing the devastation that has brought. And I wonder, even if you aren't sort of directly affected by that, I wonder if you feel that, if you are a reasonably sensitive person, or if you are engaged with the news in any way, would you feel grief in response to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Social media has become the new town square. And one of the concepts is we need our grief witnessed. We want others to see our pain. And so that's why you're looking at social media these days and people are showing you their house that's been destroyed, or the floods, or, all the different tragedies that are happening, because we want others to know. And we're all in different places. And people often don't realize we even have stages in disasters, that we went through the heroic phase where here in Los Angeles, the firefighters were there and they were putting out our fires and doing the best they could. We're now in the honeymoon period where, there's going to be FEMA and there's GoFundMe and there's this and there's that. There's so many things to help. And we're going to move into the next phase where we realize, wait, I'm not eligible for that. I've reached the max on that. And after we realize the limitations, we're not going to build back as well and as quickly as we thought. That's when the grief is going to set in. And that happens all around, where the grief often comes when the world and the news has moved on.
So, David, we're living in an increasingly secular world. A lot of people don't consider themselves connected to faith traditions, or they've made a conscious choice to disengage from them. Does that make it harder?
It does. And from a practical sense, that a lot of times your grief support in your community was in your church, was in your synagogue, was in your place of worship. And so we don't have those places to rely on. Also, many times rituals that were in our religion brought us comfort. And I think we're having to find ways to have rituals outside of our religion if that isn't resonating for us. And yet so many people do find comfort in those religious aspects and spirituality. I think there is something about gathering. Now, the interesting thing is now many of us are gathering online, but there is something about gathering around the grief, because the grief is part of the love. And it does feel very sacred, and it does connect us in a way that feels somewhat spiritual.
We said earlier in this conversation that you said that, we're kind of illiterate at grief. Do you ever worry that we get tapped out on grief?
I do worry that we get grief fatigue. It's just, how many things can I deal with? And then going back to the individual, wait a minute, I've had this loss. And Michelle, I want to tell you about it. And you're like, David, I can't take another thing going on. And some of us are already empty from just dealing with COVID and all the other things in the world. So we're coming to this moment with an empty tank, having to deal with more grief fatigue.
Well, what do you recommend? I bet there are people saying, I feel cheated in a way because no one is seeing the pain that I'm in. And I'm guessing there are other people who, maybe even the same person, who would say, well, I can't be present for this person because I'm already dealing with my own stuff. And it leaves everybody feeling bruised and unheard. And what are your thoughts about that? How should we face this moment?
Well, I think one of the things is to realize, first of all, the grief is real. We need to name it, and it's exhausting. And to know we've got grief brain, we've got mental exhaustion from all of that. The other thing is, grief needs dedicated time. It doesn't need a lot, but it needs dedicated time. Michelle, can we take 5 minutes just to talk about my dad? Can we take 5 minutes just to talk about, I know you don't want to talk about what's going on in the world, but just can we find those little pockets? Even sometimes for our own grief, can we just make our shower, maybe in the morning, our safe grief space? The other thing I teach people is to be careful where and how you tell your story. Some of us have really nice curated social media where everyone's really validating and there for us. For others, putting your grief out on your social media can be a dangerous thing. The other thing is you have to take care of ourselves during this time and set boundaries. You know, I'm going to only watch these 3 news shows. I'm going to remember to have fun. I'm going to take time for myself in these ways. And I think the other thing we have to become good at is supporting others. That means when you tell me about your grief, for me not to respond with, oh, well, did you hear about that grief? Instead, to just listen to you for a few moments. And I always tell people, don't start a sentence with at least. Well, at least they died quickly, or at least you don't have this going on. Rather, to see people and be with them.
Do you feel could we be better? Do you think people can be better at this?
Absolutely. One of the things that is my most visited on my own website is literally the best and worst things to say to people in grief. We don't know what to say to people in grief. And we often make the mistake of, I just won't say nothing because I don't want to do it wrong. And that's really bad in itself. And here's the thing. People don't need fixing because they're not broken. They're in grief. They don't need a solution. We just need to say, I don't have the right words, but I'm going to be here with you as you walk through the grief of your home, your loved one, the world. You're not walking alone. And I always teach people in grief, I know you have that one person. You tried to talk to them, it didn't work out. You tried to talk to your sister, your aunt, your best friend, it didn't work out. Stop going to them. With your grief, they can still be your wonderful sister, but no matter how many times you walk up and down the aisle of a hardware store, you'll never find milk. If your sister is grief illiterate, then you need to choose someone else who speaks grief.
Well, David Kessler, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you so much. And I always tell people, our tendency is to run from grief because it's the pain we want to run from. But what we run from pursues us, and what we face transforms us.
Thank you.
Now to the ever-evolving saga of the Trump administration's tariff policies, which business leaders say are raising hell across the country. Ryan Peterson is the founder and CEO of global logistics platform Flexport. He joins Walter Isaacson to discuss how companies are responding to the changing landscape and what consumers can expect.
Thank you, Bianna and Ryan Peterson. Thank you for joining the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
You have this company called Flexport, which helps people ship goods across borders. Tell me what the on-again, off-again, up-and-down nature of tariffs is doing.
It's been really difficult. So we help businesses ship their products from wherever they're made to wherever they're sold across actually 147 countries, but our biggest market, biggest destination is the United States. And companies that are going through this kind of bullwhip whiplash effect have been on some level, somewhere between paralyzed and just kind of stuck. Like they don't know how to plan anything, and a lot of them are there's a mix of emotions: anger, feeling like everything they built got taken away from them overnight, and then kind of the next day it's relief and celebration. So it's been a crazy couple of months really since the election.
Does that whipsawing make things harder for people to plan?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And these supply chains are they're really long-term things. Like you don't set up a new factory overnight, and you don't do it on a short-term basis. You do it, say, okay, this is going to be our new source of supply for the next 5 to 10 years or more. And so if the tariffs are changing every single week, then it's very hard to make a decision. You're like, okay, tariffs are high on China, we should move them to Vietnam. Well, next thing you know, the tariffs on Vietnam go up, and you try to move it to Europe or Mexico. I mean, it's very difficult to make plans.
You probably got a higher visibility than almost anybody into exactly what's coming into the United States. Tell me what you're seeing in the numbers.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most interesting thing we saw was after April 9th, which is the day that the tariffs took effect on China, and that was when you had 145% duty. Immediately that week, the imports of goods from China, the booking of new shipments coming from China went down by 60%. And that's true within our own customer base at Flexport, but also true across the wider industry. So you had a 60% decline in ocean freight volumes for about 5 weeks.
And what does it look like now? Can you see what ocean freights are coming in?
Yeah, and so that lasted about 5 weeks. And then when the tariffs were relaxed and dialed back to 30% on China, you then had this huge surge of bookings. And it was basically people making up for lost time that they had these goods. And now they're worried that the tariffs may go up again 90 days later. So they want to get as much in as they can at the 30% rate. So you've actually had an increase of 80% above the pre-tariff, pre-April 2nd norm that we had. So it's a huge surge. And in the meantime, the ocean carriers, so these are the companies that operate the ships, they pulled about 25% of all the container ships going from China to the US and moved them to other trade lanes, especially down to Latin America, to Africa, to some other trades. And so there's not enough capacity now to move all those containers. So the price of freight in the last 2 weeks has gone up about 3x over where it was before the tariffs hit. So it's kind of like importers can't catch a break. One day, the tariffs get relaxed, everybody's happy, and then the price of freight goes up 3 times.
How does this actually work when the tariffs are going up and down and changing around or whatever, and you're in the port of New Orleans or the port of Los Angeles? Are there people there who just have a little sheet that tell you every day, here's what it should cost?
Well, it's similar to doing your own taxes. It's on you to get it right. It don't help you that much. You have an industry called customs brokers, of which Flexport is one of many customs brokers in the United States. And they're there to kind of hold your hand and help you through it, just like a tax accountant would help you. And so but you do need good tools, and these customs brokers need good tools as well to figure out exactly what you need to file. So then you can actually file your customs entry about up to 5 days before the goods arrive at the port. So you file that paperwork, you get the goods released, and then you pay your duties, and you're on your way. So
you previously said there'd be mass shortages this summer, given all the turmoil and the new tariffs. We're pretty much getting into summer now. Do you still see that?
Well, my view on shortages is really if they don't do anything about the tariffs and they kept them at the 145%, they've relaxed it. And so now you see this big surge of goods coming in. So I wouldn't say mass shortages. However, all these goods is still not enough to make it up for that 5 weeks where you had only 40% of the normal cargo flows coming from China to the US. We had 5 weeks of really depressed volume. You've had 2 weeks of big bookings, but not enough ships to move all that cargo. So you are going to see some degree of shortages. I wouldn't call it mass shortages, but you're going to see a lot of, really it probably gets reflected in high prices, because whenever there's scarcity of goods, whoever does have goods can charge kind of whatever price they want. And so that's actually the real driver of inflation.
Give me some of the early indicators you see of things that are going to cost a lot more when there may be shortages.
Well, one of the big ones is apparel. A lot of the apparel and brands in this country were using an exemption called de minimis, and that actually allowed you to ship items, one item at a time, individual products, duty free from overseas. And so that was taken away for goods made in China, which is 70% of those. So any apparel made in China is going to go up quite a bit. You've already seen that take hold, where some of these e-commerce brands have raised prices 30% or more if they were previously using the de minimis, which a lot of them were. And then just broad categories. Furniture is a big one. Furniture is also going to get especially hard hit by these high ocean freight prices, just because you can't fit that many couches in a container. So if the price of a container goes up a lot, it's not shared by that many items. So kind of larger, bulkier stuff is what gets hit by the high ocean freight prices. And then duties, it's a kind of across the board with the 30% duty. Anything made in China, the stuff, it's really better stuff that's not affected, which is kind of electronics, semiconductors. Your smartphone got an exemption.
You said a little while ago, thousands and then millions of American small businesses, including many iconic brands, will go bankrupt this year if the tariff policies on China don't change. How quickly does a trade deal need to be done to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, that was really about the 145%. At 30%, it seems like businesses can absorb it. They're not happy at all, and it definitely hurts their P&L, but I don't think it wipes them out. But where we are, is in August, this is going to go, they said August 30th now for a lot of products, it's going to go back up to 54%. That was when they first announced 54%, that was really a catastrophic day for importers from China. And so it's somewhere in that range where if that comes back to 54%, I do think you're going to see a huge wave of companies start to fail. And that's imminent. In the middle of August will be here before you know it. So we'd like to see either this gets extended or a deal gets done before then. But I don't have any inside view into what's happening with the negotiation right now.
Walmart CEO Doug McMillon and I think their chief financial officer John Rainey and others have said it's definitely just going to have to be passed on to some extent to consumers. When you're talking to your people, to what extent are they going to pass this on to consumers, and to what extent do you think they can absorb the new tariffs?
It's relatively straightforward to look at it mathematically, and it's all about what's the profit margin of that business. If it's a very, very profitable business where they buy the goods cheap and sell them for a lot more, the tariff, remember, is on the wholesale cost. It's on the cost of what they pay for. So those companies can, but the reality is most companies, and Walmart's in that category, are trying to be cost leaders. They're trying to have low costs, and that means they don't put a huge amount of margin on their product. And it's therefore, when the cost goes up, they're forced to pass it through. So I think that's the reality for most companies. They're going to have to pass it through close to 100%. And that's what we see in the e-commerce world. You've seen these brands have effectively come through. A lot of them actually added a line item in the checkout that says import charges or customs charges. And customers are kind of pretty understanding about that. Tariffs have been so much in the news that there haven't been a lot of pushback so far. But the reality is we don't know until this really stays for a while and you see how much is demand repressed. Are people just buying a lot less stuff? That's what you would predict. And people start spending their money on other things that are made in America. And it doesn't have to be things. It can be services. It can be going out to eat, travel, etc.
You talked about how people have to change their supply chain. If something happens on China, and then maybe they're going to try to do Vietnam or maybe even other places. How hard is it? Explain to me how that works. How easy is it to say, let me shift my supply chain based on the changing tariff regimes?
It's really hard because, you have to build a new trusted relationship with a new factory that can make your goods at scale with quality. And it's your product, right? It's the lifeblood of a company. So it is not a simple proposition at all. One of the things that's made it a little bit easier, ironically, is that Chinese companies are actually setting up factories in other countries so you can still work with the same company at least.
Do you think that the administration might try to stop that workaround, I'd call it?
I assume that this is on their radar and not something that they love. I don't know exactly how to do it legally because they are setting up an entity. It's in Vietnam. The way in Vietnam or Thailand, you see a lot of this in Cambodia. There's factories being built in Mexico that are owned by Chinese, but it's a local entity. They're doing the right thing. They're doing it legally in terms of making it a product of Vietnam. But there are a lot of Chinese components that go into that. So they'll bring goods down to Vietnam, do a process that's called substantial transformation. It's a kind of a fancy term, but it just means that you've done enough transformation of those goods to legally qualify it under U.S. customs law as made in Vietnam or made in Thailand. That makes you subject to the duty rates in those countries. I think what the Trump administration would like to see happen is that those countries sort of take the American side and say, hey, you have to put duties up on Chinese imports, including the components that are going into your products. That's probably the best mechanism they have, is sort of saying, hey, Vietnam, if you want to have low tariffs, you're only at 10% right now. If you want to keep it there, you've got to agree to some kind of a deal on these Chinese components coming in to make it more difficult. So there's definitely some room for negotiation there, but I don't know how exactly you can structure it legally.
You've kind of explained a pretty complicated rigmarole. To what extent does that add to the inefficiency and the costs in general of a supply chain?
Just a huge amount. I mean, first off, the labor cost is higher in some of these places and not just like raw, okay, you want to hire someone off the street, but the skilled labor. A lot of these are real craftsman jobs. You talk to people doing apparel and they'll tell you the highest quality apparel now is made in China. The best seamstresses, the best technique and skilled workers there. So you move to another country, by definition, taking a step down on quality. It's really funny for people, my age, where that was not the idea 20 years ago at all. So China's come a long way on quality, but the inefficiency of trade, you're shipping items more than once from China to Vietnam, then from Vietnam to the US. And ironically, you might actually increase trade from a technical term because that's 2 trade shipments instead of 1. And so you're seeing, add complexity here, adds cost, inefficiency, time. Time is money. So it takes longer to, keep moving things around to different parts of the world. So there's nothing efficient about it.
It seems to me that the response of a lot of the CEOs in the business of importing, making things, has been kind of muted. I mean, you talk to all these people and you're saying they all have some anxiety, but I haven't heard a lot of outcry. Why is that?
Yeah, well, if you talk to the smaller companies where it's kind of still founder-led, the CEO, the owner of the company is still there, you'll hear a lot. They're quite vocal. They have a hard time getting their voice out. They're not famous and they're not part of a big famous company, but these kind of e-commerce brands, they're definitely out there. They're really appreciative of what we've been doing. Flexport is trying to tell their story for them. And you do have a little bit more of a platform than your average company. But I don't know what it is. Big companies, they've maybe it's because they have inside access. They're able to go and talk directly to the White House and have their voice heard there rather than needing to do it via the public airwaves. Maybe there's something about being founder led. Some of these small companies, we founders, we can't be fired. So take a little bit more risk. And it does feel a little risky perhaps to come out and criticize the government and think maybe there's going to be backlash or something like that. So I think if you're a professional CEO, you're hired by your board, maybe it's harder to take that kind of a risk to put your name out there.
These tariff uncertainties, as you've talked about, have led to some supply chain shocks. And we had that a few years ago when COVID led to that. Do you think that there's some lessons there that we may have to just reevaluate the whole notion of these supply chains?
Well, there are. We learned a lot in COVID. One thing we learned was that companies, the price of freight is very inelastic, which means you don't ship more stuff just because the price of freight is cheap. And it turns out you also really don't ship less stuff because the price of freight is expensive. You ship the amount of stuff that you can sell at a profit. And the price of freight tends to be relatively marginal around the edges on that. And so the world can absorb a lot higher prices of freight than we ever expected. Tariffs are different though, because, a 50% tariff, the average price of a container is about $100,000 for the goods in there. So that's $50,000 extra. Price of freight, we saw in COVID, it went to $20,000 and people begrudgingly paid it, but $50,000 is another story. So we're going to find out what that elasticity is. How much do people just keep shipping the same amount? So that was one set of lessons there, was just the freight markets themselves being really dynamic and subject to big price swings. The other one, do you want to source globally? Should we think more regionally or, stop having such complex global supply chains? The reality is that companies are always going to try to make their products as cheaply as they can. That is the job at the end of the day of companies. Make great products cheaply. Whoever does that the best will win. The consumer will grow. It's a Darwinian kind of ecosystem. And so that's the game that's being played on. That's the game on the field. The government job is to set the rules, and then companies have to go and find a way to make money. And they will always look for opportunity. And this is a long run trend. COVID was a moment in time. We have a moment in time now. There's changing landscape, but global trade has gone on for thousands of years. And in fact, we've had about 4% annual growth in global trade since the Mongol invasions. For 800 years, you've had this steady exponential growth. And so my view is sort of like, yeah, there's repositioning here, but human nature is you want to find the best manufacturer at the lowest price so you can make a profit. You want to find your best customer. You don't really much care what country they are, what they look in. You're looking at the attributes of what their price is that they charge and what they pay. And therefore, you're going to want to do global trade. Governments will try to rein that in, but the market forces are such that it'll be very hard for it to, the cat's out of the bag in a sense.
Ryan Peterson, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
If I were to pose a question about significant figures in Russian history, who would spring to mind? You might think of well-known leaders like Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, or President Putin. But how many of you could name the women who stood alongside them? A new book written by our next guest, Russian-American writer Julia Ioffe, confronts the forgotten narratives of these women and places their remarkable stories in the spotlight. Ioffe joins Michel Martin to discuss Russia's complex history of motherhood, marriage, and much more.
Thanks, Christian. Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Your new book, Motherland, is so interesting. It looks through modern Russian history, Soviet and Russian history, but through the lens of the women. How did you get the idea to do that?
Well, the first germ of the idea was to write a book that wasn't about Vladimir Putin. I was so tired of talking about him, writing about him, thinking about him, and I wanted to write a book about Russia that wasn't about him. And then I realized I wanted it to not be about most of the men that we read so much about. The Vladimir Lenins, the Joseph Stalins, the Nikita Khrushchevs. And then the other part of the idea came from the fact that I was constantly having to explain to American friends, to Western friends, why it was so normal for women like my great-grandmothers to be doctors in the 1930s and scientists. And something that seemed completely extraordinary to them was totally ordinary to me. And so to bridge that gap, I realized I had to tell the story of the whole thing.
You write about this extraordinary social revolution that followed 1917. Soviet women were, quote, given the right to higher education, equal pay, no-fault civil divorce, child support, including for children born out of wedlock, paid maternity leave, and access to free maternity hospitals. And in 1920, the Soviet Union legalized abortion. How did that happen?
Well, the new Soviet authorities, the Bolshevik authorities, wanted to emancipate women, and they wanted to destroy the bourgeois family, which they felt imprisoned women. It was part of their project to remake society, starting from the individual, to remake a Soviet person. And if you think about where they were coming from, in the 19th century, women married mostly for economic reasons, right? They went from their father's house to their husband's house, and it was impossible to get out of that out of that marriage, even if there was abuse or cheating, or she just didn't want to be married to him anymore. There was nowhere to go. Women were expected to, working class women were expected to work through their pregnancies and come right back right after giving birth, right? I mean, you don't even have to think about the 19th century, right? We're still fighting for these rights here today, 100 years later.
I feel sort of embarrassed that I didn't know some of these names. Everybody knows Lenin. But who was Alexandra, how am I say it correctly, Kollontai?
Yeah, that's right.
Who was she? And tell us why she was such an important figure.
So she became an ally of Vladimir Lenin, and she voted with him in the Bolshevik Central Committee to seize power in October 1917, for which she was rewarded with a cabinet ministerial post. So she became the first female cabinet minister in history. But she was a writer and a thinker that really fleshed out the ideas of how to emancipate women specifically. Marxist writers, most of the men, wrote about how to get rid of capitalism, get rid of private property, and how this would just emancipate everyone. And Kollontai said, well, no, women do have specific needs. She wrote that the most important thing for a woman, the thing that gave her meaning in life and gave her purpose on this earth, wasn't getting married, wasn't having children, but her own work, her own creative labor. And she could get married if she wanted to. She could not. She could have a fling or an affair to drink from the cup of love until she was sated, as Kollontai wrote, and then get back to work. She wrote that in 1913. I think that is still a very controversial and radical statement today.
So I was fascinated by Raisa Gorbachev because, a lot of Americans had seen her because she traveled here with her husband. Just talk a little bit about her.
Raisa didn't really fit in at home. Mm-hmm. Soviets really hated her. They didn't like that she was so independent. They didn't like that she was one of her husband's closest advisors. She helped him write his speeches. She was with him on foreign trips everywhere. It was really jarring for Soviets to see her when they had been used for decades to seeing only old male faces at the top. She was stylish and kind of running around the world at a time when Soviet women couldn't find clothes or food to eat. They didn't have menstrual products. They didn't have bras. They gave birth in filthy conditions in these maternity hospitals that were just horrific, as I describe in the book. And they certainly couldn't travel abroad the way she did. And she enchanted a lot of people in the West, including American feminists who said, "Oh, look at her. She's this amazing working woman who has it all. She's a wife, a mother, a grandmother, as well as a college professor, a PhD, and she's still so feminine. How does she do it?" Where Soviet women were like, our lives look nothing like hers, and we hate her for rubbing it in our faces.
Then we get to Putin, and I know you said you didn't want the book to be about Putin. It's not, but it's about because he does take up a lot of space. That was one of the most depressing chapters for you about why they dated for years before they actually married, which is unusual at the time. And he kind of made it clear that, she was there to kind of be his administrative officer and raise the kids and do whatever, but didn't give her any kind of support or affection from what we see at all. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about her?
So Lyudmila Putina, who is now Lyudmila Chiretna, because she's done okay. She's married a man 10 years her junior. For her silence, she has gotten lots and lots of money. She has mansions all over Europe, including Belarus. Okay. She's doing fine. Okay. But Lyudmila Putina was born in Kaliningrad, which is kind of this outcropping of Russia in the middle of Europe. And she had an alcoholic father. She lived in a communal apartment. She dropped out of technical college and became a flight attendant. And she met Vladimir Putin when they were in their early 20s. And she at first thought he was quite unremarkable, but then she came to really admire him because he was so unlike other men their age. He didn't drink. He was physically fit. He was disciplined. He was focused. He was decisive. And in a generation that was born after World War II, when there weren't a lot of men around, and the men that were around were kind of broken psychologically, alcoholic. I mean, alcoholism took off like crazy after World War II because of all the trauma people suffered. And he just struck such a contrast that she was like, this is a real man, and I want to cede some of the responsibilities that Russian women have. So when he starts making every single decision for them, and she has absolutely no agency in the relationship, she really finds it comforting and reassuring because she doesn't feel like she's carrying everything. But then, of course, quickly, once they actually do get married, after he strings her along for 3 years, once they do have kids, she realizes it's all completely on her.
In fact, the most disturbing story is then she was in a car accident and wakes up in the hospital and...
Sure. Vladimir Putin is called. He's now the second man in the city. This is now post-communist St. Petersburg. He races over to the hospital. They're like, oh, she's going to be fine. And he says, okay, and leaves without seeing her, which is just incredible. Which in the worst way. But it was, to me, it was so him, right? It was before he was really in the public eye, and the kind of the coldness, the cruelness, the withholding of warmth and affection, the little things we see him do, these little power plays, like when he made the Pope wait 45 minutes. With Ludmila, he was late to every single date by about an hour and a half, and she still came back for more.
And why did she put up with this?
Well, because men were so scarce after the war, and this really traumatized Russian women who were also being told that they have to get married young and have children young, because the Soviet government started telling them this because they needed to replace all the people they had killed. About 50 million people that were killed in just 30 years. So there was this obvious absence of men, of eligible men to marry, and it was just like, I'll take him.
So then let's go to the present day. You're right. 100 years after Kollontai and Lenin railed against traditional, economically motivated marriage as a prison for Russian women, it had become their ultimate fantasy. And the evidence of that is in other chapters in the book where you talk about these wives of oligarchs, these former wives of oligarchs, and this mad, I don't know what to call it, like Hunger Games match for these men. How did that happen?
So what happened is the Soviet government, in fighting part of one world war and all of a second world war, a civil war, having mass famines and putting down peasant rebellions and having mass political repressions, killed a lot of men. By the end of 1945, there were so few men in some places that there would be 19 of them for every 100 women. And at the same time, the Soviet Union really wanted a baby boom, the kind that the U.S. was having, because they needed to, as they said, replace the dead. And there were villages in Russia where only one man came back from the war, and his wife would pass her husband around so that the other women in the village could become mothers as well. So this combination of the state telling women they need to become mothers, that this is their, unlike what Kollontai was saying, that their main role in life, their sole purpose in life was to become mothers. When there were so few men around, how do you do that? So it creates this mismatch between supply and demand.
But you also write about the connection to the way wealth is achieved in Russia, and just this tremendous sort of economic dislocations that have occurred since the fall of communism. Would you talk, which are two different stories, but they're kind of related. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Like the drinking, right? The drinking, it doesn't come from nowhere.
That's right. So basically, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, with it collapsed the teetering Soviet economy. Factories closed, mines closed, and parts of the Soviet government closed, and men and women responded very differently. Men said, I was a factory foreman, or I was an engineer. I will not do lower status work. I'm going to sit around and be sad and complain and wait for work of my status, of my station to come back online. And the women didn't have that option, and they took to drink because they were depressed and, stressed out. The women didn't have that option because for the last 50 years, parenthood had become motherhood. Motherhood became all of parenthood. Fathers weren't expected to father their children and parent them in any way. So women didn't have this option, and they had to work really hard, wash floors, schlep rags from Turkey to sell in markets, chop chicken parts to keep their families fed, while the men just lay down, took to drink, and drank themselves to death, which again exacerbated this perceived shortage of men. And at the same time, there was this new oligarchic class coming into being, and they were all men. And they had such fantastical wealth that, plus all the imagery coming in from the West, there was this idea of wouldn't it be wild and amazing to be a stay-at-home wife and a mom? So instead of being a Soviet woman who has to work full time, do 7 hours of housework per day and take care of the kids full time while the man just maybe works. The idea was, well, can I just be a mom?
You know, these pictures of Putin, you know, bare chested, you know, shirtless on horseback, or Putin, you know, fishing or playing hockey where magically he scores all the goals. In the West, we think this is hilarious.
Yeah.
You know, we're like, what is this? Like, what's this guy? You were saying that in Russia, this is actually part of his allure, and that it's actually directed at the women.
Yes.
Because the women find this, comforting in a way. Like, say more about that.
Yeah. So because Russian men are seen as so useless, as these kind of overgrown man children that the women have to take care of in addition to their actual children, you know, they can't be trusted with the money. They earn more than the women, but, you know, can they be trusted to bring it home? Can they be trusted not to drink through everything, not to get into a crazy car accident or just drop dead at work? Russian men die so much younger than Russian women. They're in such terrible health and in such terrible shape. They smoke, they drink, they eat a lot of mayonnaise salads. And Putin is so not that. He doesn't drink. He exercises regularly and on camera. He makes sure people see it. He makes sure to show people how disciplined he is, how much longer he's lived than the average Russian man. And for a lot of Russian women, he is the man they never had and the man they wish they had, which also goes back to your question about why did Lyudmila Putina stick with him for as long as she did? Because, yeah, he was maybe not the nicest partner, but at least he was there and he had this kind of traditional, virile, energetic image, whereas the average Russian man is seen as this drunken, childish slob.
I doubt that Motherland is going to be, you know, a bestseller in Russia. I don't know that we'll be seeing too many copies in the airport bookstore. But I'm wondering, what are people saying about it?
The reaction I'm getting from Russians is actually very positive. A lot of them, the ones that were able to read it in English, didn't know a lot of this history. I didn't know most of this history, and it's just not taught. What Russians are taught, what I was taught studying Soviet and Russian history here in the U.S. is a very male-centric history. And I didn't know about Alexandra Kollontai, for example, until I started researching this book. A lot of, you know, I kept giving chapters to my parents to read, to ask them, or to other friends from the kind of Russia sphere to read, like, did you know any of this? Or am I just repeating something everybody else has said? And most people didn't know any of this. So people are pleasantly surprised and have found it illuminating. But yeah, we're working on getting it translated into Russian, so at least it can get into the country digitally. But, you know, I have a friend who runs a publishing house in Russia, and she said there's no way with the word feminist. And it's not because of the way Putin is portrayed, but because it has feminist on the cover. And she said, you know, at a time when Susan Sontag's books are being seized by police from stores, there's no way.
Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Now to the crackdown on history itself, from removing museum exhibits on American slavery to paintings over Washington, D.C.'s Black Lives Matter mural. Scholars and activists say Trump's DEI purge is minimizing and even erasing Black history. And our next guest is acutely aware of the impact. Monroe Nichols is mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma. His new initiative, Road to Repair, would grant the city's Black community over $100 million to address harms caused by the Tulsa race massacre of 1921. And Mayor Nichols joins Michelle Martin to discuss the importance of confronting the country's past.
Thanks, Christiane. Mayor Nichols, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
So before we get into the details of the project that you're trying to, the effort that you're making in Tulsa, I just wanted to kind of take you back a little bit. You were actually born in Waco, Texas. Yeah. You moved to Oklahoma to go to college. and also to play football, but mainly to go to college.
Right.
I just wanted to ask you if you remember when you heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre, because this was an historical event that for some people, clearly not for survivors and the people who lived through it, but for many people had been kind of lost to history. Will you tell people who may not have heard of this what happened? And I'm particularly interested in what you first heard had happened versus what you learned later.
Yeah, I mean, what I first heard had happened is just that there's this riot in Tulsa where Black Wall Street was destroyed. That was like the basis of the knowledge, right? And so I didn't have much beyond that. But for the people who were watching, what existed in Tulsa at one time was an entrepreneurial center. It was almost like a city within a city where you had movie theaters and grocery stores and doctors' offices and attorneys' offices and schools and churches that all thrived in what was a very segregated society here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District would become known as Black Wall Street because of all the commerce in and out of this part of our community. On May 31st and June 1st, a 24-hour period saw a massacre that saw a white mob come to Greenwood and burn to the ground about 37 blocks, about 1,200 Black businesses and homes, and left thousands of people homeless and some even put into camps. The death toll is believed to be over 300, although only reported as 36 at the time by local officials. And it is the only documented aerial assault on an American city in our nation's history. So it was a massacre of epic proportions, and it destroyed what was perhaps the greatest example of Black excellence in economics and entrepreneurship that the country had seen at the time, and that's what happened in that 24-hour period from May 31st to June 1st.
The only sort of minor edit I would make to that is people may remember that there's a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was also bombed by government officials. There was a sort of a Black radical group that had kind of taken up residence there, but that is also seen as a modern atrocity. But here's the other thing. You said you had initially heard of this as a riot, and it has now been known as a massacre. And there's a real reason that matters. Could you just explain why that matters so much? Then it's not just a matter of words, that the nomenclature is not just a matter of which word. It has real force.
Absolutely. It has real force, and it was in some ways a matter of legality. A riot meant that it was easier to deny insurance claims for folks who had lost homes and businesses. And honestly had a lot of people escape any level of culpability. To this day, not one person went to jail because of, their involvement. Until this day, not one government has repaid back to help rebuild in ways that were directly associated with bringing back what was lost. There were promises made to do that even directly after the massacre. Did not happen. So naming it a riot all these years meant that there's a lot of people who got to escape culpability, both on the individual side and the public institutional side. And it wasn't until, more about this came out that it was clear this was not a riot. This was a slaughtering of a people, because we now know the numbers. We now know what was lost. We know now what was refused to be restored, for example. It was certainly a massacre of epic proportions. And to your point about Philadelphia and other places, I think the other great thing about uncovering our history is that we know about other places where things like this happen, maybe not at the same scale where you have 300 dead, but Wilmington, North Carolina is another example of a place where this stuff happened. And I think it's important that as we consider what we're doing with the Greenwood Trust, that we find good models for how you begin to mitigate the harm, because it exists. The legacy of the massacre is very palpable in Tulsa. It doesn't mean that people don't like each other and we have that, but there's this subtleness about it that still has this community kind of held by the chains of division in ways that just prevent you from uniting in the way that you need to unite to meet the other big challenges that we face, that everybody faces together. And so I do think it's really important, even in this moment in our nation's history, that we're very honest about the road that it's taken to get here, and that we find ways to mitigate harm, because that's the only way that I think we can appropriately move forward.
So let's bring up to the present moment. There was a lot of attention paid to the Tulsa Race Massacre on the centennial of it back in 2021, which acknowledged the 100 years afterwards. There are still some people who survived, who were obviously very small children, at the time. There was a lot of energy around trying to figure out, what to do. But not what really happened. I mean, there were negotiations around some kind of recompense. Didn't happen. Now we're 3 years later, and you've announced a major initiative to kind of, I don't know, maybe I'll let you describe it, because it's a very comprehensive project. What is it that you have in mind?
Yeah. So just for a little bit of context, you mentioned the centennial back in 2021, and going all the way back to 2001, there was a state commission that recommended certain things the state should do to address the harm caused by the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Since then, we've had a commission of Beyond the Apology Commission that was created by my predecessor to come up with recommendations. We have advocacy groups like Justice for Greenwood and the Deep Greenwood Foundation. Where I arrived at was the creation of the Greenwood Trust, a private charitable trust that I'm going to be going out and raising capital for, $105 million, reflective of the very specific $24 million recommendation from the Beyond the Apology Commission, which is made up of descendants around housing and home ownership, a $60 million fund investing directly into cultural landmarks and the surviving entities from the massacre. There are some buildings that still stand. So making sure that we're investing in those, because they're not always in the best condition for all the reasons that we know that happens over time. And then also invest in the future by investing in college scholarships and business grants and no interest loans to businesses that are owned by descendants, so that in the end, not only are we mitigating harm, but we're ensuring that we can begin to have those same families, those descendants, rebuild the district back to where it was.
So there's a couple of things here. This really depends on raising a lot of private money. You really think you can do it?
Absolutely. I think we can do it. We've had some conversations up here. We're spending a year really planning to set the programs, to, appoint trustees, a board of directors that'll be national and local. And then we're also evaluating what public assets we have that the trust can be a beneficiary of. So there's parts of the Greenwood district that the city owns land in. And as we develop, the proceeds from those developments can go back into the trust. I think there's two things that you have to balance when you think about the political realities of where you're at. So you got one school of folks who say, well, the massacre was a long time ago. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I have to pay for it? Right? You got that going. Then you got some people even on the other side who said, well, 104 years later, we really need direct cash payment. So you're balancing these two things. And so the thought is, what do we have in the way of assets that, when developed, can produce to feed into the trust? So there's obviously some skin in the game from the public side. But the idea is, if we can create the kind of economic activity with those assets, with private capital, we can get to a space where those folks who are of the school of thought who believe that they shouldn't pay, understood. That's fine. We don't have to fight about that. We're going to make investments. We're going to do it both privately, and we're going to do it through the way of using some public assets. So
you were first elected in 2024, as I understand.
Yeah.
You just took office in 2024.
Just took office in December.
And I want to say you're also the first Black mayor, of Tulsa. And is that why you ran, in part to achieve something like this, to create this kind of energy around it?
It actually wasn't. I mean, I ran, so our city is dealing with a number of challenges. I ran on ending homelessness in 6 years, improving student outcomes, expanding our economy, making Tulsa the safest big city in the country, and working with tribal nations. Tulsa is also the largest city in the country that's all Indian reservation. That was my focus during the campaign. But about 10 days after I got elected, all these recommendations on how you mitigate harm hit your desk, and you have a decision to make. Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to put them aside and say these things aren't possible? Are you going to lean into it? And my sense is that the four things that I mentioned for the reasons that I ran for mayor, I don't think they're possible unless you do this. You communities who are divided or who have this unresolved trauma have a hard time meeting the need on all these other big challenges that we have. I think we see this all across the country. So the Greenwood Trust, although very much focused on the descendant community and mitigating harm, I think it's critical to meeting all those other goals, which are the reasons I ran for office.
In fact, you said that in the speech that you gave announcing the trust, or your sort of plans for the trust, you said there is not one Tulsan, regardless of their skin color, who wouldn't be better off today had the massacre not happened, or if generations before had done the work to restore what was lost. Will you say more about that?
I think we would have been the exception to some of those things you see all across the country. Not every place had a Greenwood district, right? Not every place had that kind of example at that kind of scale of where folks had beaten the odds, even in a segregated society. So imagine if that had gone uninterrupted, what it would look like today. Imagine the number of African Americans all across this country now who have some origins of Tulsa who would have stayed here, but who left after the massacre. Imagine all those who would have been drawn here because of the economic vitality of this community. And imagine what it would have meant for our city's economy overall. We would have been in some ways the exception of a lot of places all across the country. And so I say because of the massacre, because we had the Greenwood district, it certainly should reinforce to us that our problems from an economic standpoint were man-made, brought on by the massacre in a lot of ways, right? We had the opportunity to close the wealth gap had the massacre never happened. We had the opportunity to close the achievement gap had the massacre never happened. And we traded that. We traded that opportunity to be that shining example of how a city can thrive for everybody on May 31st and June 1st of 1921. And I still do believe it, that there's not one person in the city who wouldn't be better off had that not happened.
Well, it's interesting because the pretext for the massacre was like so many other instances of violence directed at Black people, was an incident where it was alleged that, a white woman was mistreated. Okay. But in the sort of the light of history, the argument has subsequently, some people would argue that the reason that this violence took on this kind of vicious mass quality was jealousy. It was economic jealousy. That there was a certain cohort of people who couldn't tolerate the fact that Black people in Greenwood were as successful as they were. Those folks have descendants too. And so the question becomes, do you think you can persuade those descendants that all these years later, even they will be better off if these initiatives take place?
Oh, absolutely. I think I would tell the folks who descend from those families who were more the perpetrator side of the massacre, that they would have benefited a great deal. They wouldn't have the legacy of something so horrible as a stain on their family's history. They could talk about openly their family's history with pride. And I think that's something that was also taken from those families. And so I believe that Tulsa's a much different place. I know Tulsa's a much different place in 2025 than it was in 1921. And I think that's the message right now, right? Like, we are not that far removed from the massacre in a lot of ways. There's still two survivors that live today. I just visited Mother Fletcher and Mother Randall last Wednesday. Mother Fletcher is very sharp. She's 111 years old, but she is here. Sometimes I think we think about history when you see black and white pictures and you think, oh my goodness, that was such a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago, right? When we think about the overarching kind of context of history. And so, I would absolutely tell those folks, they more so than almost anybody would be better off had the massacre not happened. But I think it also should reinforce in them this need to do something about it, right? I think when I think about restoration and righteousness, it's also about getting right with that family history that those folks might have. I don't blame them no more than I blame anybody else. So it's not a question of blame, but it is a question of courage. Do we have the courage to do something that's difficult to do at a time where it's difficult to do it? Do we have the courage to cross the train tracks and talk about the lived experience of our neighbors in a way that we haven't done before? Because I think when you do that, it makes the Greenwood Trust a very easy sell, right? When you just begin to bind those own wounds, it makes stuff incredibly easy.
Mayor, before we let you go, this initiative arrives at a really interesting time when some people would call this a backlash moment to these kinds of initiatives. Do you see headwinds at this point?
Significant headwinds, but so much of that is less about the national context, because we've had times where one could argue it would have been a better time to have a conversation like this, but it didn't happen then either. So there's never really a right time that we found in 104 years to have this conversation. So I think you just got to meet it with a whole lot of honesty and transparency and not be afraid to talk about it in certain spaces. Again, and I said this in the speech last Sunday, this is not an effort to assign blame. This is an effort to address the harm caused by an event that is a historical fact. And that's the reason why we released the 45,000 pages of unreleased documents that we're sitting on. That's why we continue the Graves investigation, because families deserve closure. And I think everybody can understand that. This is not about going and saying, oh, look how evil certain people are in this community. It's just like, no, people just need closure to know what happened to their loved one. Even in a moment like this, think about the opportunity for us. While everybody's having a much different conversation about race, imagine if Tulsa, all of us came together and we made this happen. Just like I said, we would have been an outlier had the Greenwood district remained uninterrupted. We would also be an outlier nationally of how people who are all political strides, all different races, are coming together saying this is in our value set, and we're going to do what we can, even with the constraints that we have, to make these investments. It actually helps us stand out in ways that I want Tulsa to stand out. This gives us the opportunity to make sure that June 1st wasn't the end of the story. We get to write new chapters on it in a way that I think we provide the rest of the country with a pathway with how you can engage these kind of conversations. I think that's an important contribution to make, but it's also about us getting right with ourselves and making sure we can move this community forward as one big united city. And so if we have to take a look back 104 years to think about how we go forward tomorrow, that's an investment of time and effort that's well worth it.
Mr. Mayor, Monroe Nichols IV, the mayor of Tulsa, thank you so much for speaking with us. I do hope we'll speak again. I'd love to hear how it's going.
I can't wait to do that.
Next to the online world, which can be infuriating, isolating, and downright dangerous, with the rise of AI-generated ads, pop-ups, and reams of information, author Cory Doctorow says the internet is getting worse fast, and he's joining Hari Srinivasan to discuss his latest book, examining what's gone wrong and how we can fix it.
Christian, thanks. Cory Doctorow, you've got a new book out called Injectification: Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. This is now a word that has been in kind of common slang for a couple of years. Some dictionaries are picking up on it too. First, for our audience, what does it mean?
Well, thank you. For most of my adult life now, I've worked for a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation that does digital rights work. I've spent most of my life coming up with different metaphors and similes and and framing devices for this. And Injectification is the latest one, and it's done really well. It's a way of talking about how platforms go bad, but also about why platforms go bad. So it describes this pattern of platform decay. First, platforms are good to their end users. They find a way to lock those end users in, and once it's hard for them to leave, they make things worse for them in order to make things better for business customers who also get lured into the platform. Once they're locked in, the platform withdraws all of the value from those sellers as well, and eventually it's just a pile of right. Eventually the platform is fully decayed, end stage injectification. But the more interesting thing is the questions it raises and the answers it proposes for why it's happening now.
So, kind of walk us through examples that people would be familiar with. I mean, you spend quite a bit of time on Facebook, and, there's about 3 billion people on the planet that know what that it's like. So kind of walk us through how this process has played itself out on something we're familiar with.
Yeah, Facebook started with a very attractive proposition. They went to people who were using MySpace, which was the big social media platform of the day, and they said, we will never, ever spy on you. And so people piled into the platform. They identified the people who mattered to them. They got a feed consisting solely of the things they asked to see. But they also locked themselves in. They locked themselves in through something economists call the collective action problem, which you may know as the problem of getting the 6 people in your group chat to agree on what board game you're going to play this weekend or what movie you're going to see. Only when it's a couple of hundred people on Facebook, and some of you are there because that's where the people with your rare disease are hanging out, or where you meet with the people who live in the country you left behind, or how you find your customers or your audience, or just plan the Little League carpool. It can be really hard to go. And so once Facebook knows that you can't leave anymore, they start phase 2 of insuification, making things worse for you to make things better for business customers. So they go to, the advertisers and they say, hey, do you remember when we told these suckers that we weren't going to spy on them? Obviously, that's a lie. We spy on them with every hour that God sends. We have these incredibly detailed non-consensual dossiers on them. And if you give us remarkably small sums of money, we will target ads to them with incredible fidelity. They go to the publishers and they say, you remember when we told these people we were only going to show them things they asked to see? Obviously, that's a lie too. We will cram stuff into people's eyeballs who never asked to see it. All you need to do is put excerpts from your own website on Facebook with a link back to your own website so people can click on it, and we'll just show it to people who never asked to see it. So they get locked in too. They become dependent on us. We know a lot about monopoly in kind of our daily lives. We think a lot about what happens when there's just a few sellers, but it's actually just as bad when there's just a few buyers. So you get this monopsony lock-in, right, where Facebook has control over its sellers, and it makes things worse for them. We see ad prices going through the roof. We see ad targeting fidelity going through the floor. We see ad fraud exploding. Publishers had to put more and more of their content on Facebook. You had to put so much that there was no reason to visit your website. And of course, no one was gonna, because if you put a link to your own website on Facebook, they wouldn't show it to anyone because maybe that link was a malicious link. And so we end up with this kind of deadlock where we are holding each other hostage. The businesses are held hostage by us. The amount of content in our feed that we want to see has dwindled to a kind of undetectable homeopathic residue, and the void has been filled with things that people are being ripped off to show us. And in that equilibrium where all the value has been taken by Mark Zuckerberg and his shareholders and executives, we are all one hair's breadth away from leaving.
So I wonder, look, one of the things that people are going to hear you describe this and say, why doesn't the market just fix this, right? Isn't there a better mousetrap somewhere else? Won't just people walk with their feet?
Yeah, so, we used to have mechanisms that punished companies for being bad to us. And one of them was competition, right? And so, there was a time when people were exodusing from Facebook at speed and running to a new startup called Instagram. You may recall that Facebook then bought Instagram for $1 billion at a time when it only had 12 employees. And what's really interesting about that is that as little as we were enforcing antitrust law in those days, there was one thing that we still said was illegal, and that was to buy a company in order to reduce competition. And Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, sent an email to his CFO where he defended buying Instagram, even though it only had 12 employees, for $1 billion. And he said, people prefer Instagram to Facebook. They leave Facebook. They don't come back. If we buy Instagram, we can recapture those users. That's as much of a confession of guilt as you could ask for. And yet the Obama DOJ waved that merger through, just like all of the G.W. Bush and Clinton DOJs. Everyone since Reagan has waved through pretty much every merger, except for 4 extraordinary years under Biden. We haven't had a new privacy law since 1988. The last privacy law America got out of Congress for consumers is the Video Privacy Protection Act of 1988. It's a law that makes it illegal for video store clerks to disclose your VHS rentals. That's the only technological threat you can expect to be protected against since the 1980s, since Die Hard was in theaters. So Facebook can spy on you in all these ghastly ways and do bad things to you. All of the mechanisms that used to punish companies for being bad to you, new technology and interoperability, strong workforce who cared about users, competition, regulation, all of those things were systematically dismantled. And when you take away the forces that punish people for harming you to help themselves, well, you should expect that the people who are in a position to harm you to help themselves are going to go ahead and do it.
You write about how the erosion of our antitrust frameworks and laws has created this kind of techno-feudalism. Describe what that is and who benefits.
Yeah, this is a term I got from my friend and colleague, Yanis Varoufakis, who used to be the finance minister of Greece. And Yanis wrote this book, Techno-Feudalism, where he tries to draw an important distinction between profits and rents. So profits are money that you get for making something that people like. Rents is money that you get for owning something that people need to make things. And so rents, it's passive income. It's owning a factor of production. If you're Amazon and you own the platform, then everyone who wants to sell to the American public has to pay you 45 to 51 cents out of every dollar they bring in rents. About 90% of affluent households in America have Prime. They've paid for shipping a year in advance. There's no reason to shop anywhere else. And indeed, if they find what they're looking for on Amazon, they don't shop anywhere else. And so if you want to sell anything to Americans, you have to be on Amazon. You have to give Amazon 51 cents out of every dollar you bring in. Apple and Google bring in 30 cents out of every dollar that we spend in an app. So if you're supporting a performer on Patreon, or if you are donating to a news agency, or if you're buying music or ebooks or audiobooks or movies, 30 cents out of every dollar is being captured by these tech platforms. 51 cents out of every dollar is being captured by Google and Meta. And so that's money that publishers and advertisers don't get to keep. So these rents are, they're the characteristic of feudalism, right? The difference between feudalism and capitalism, the thing that changed to turn feudalism into capitalism, was the transformation of an economy based on rents to an economy based on profits. Now, both of these have their problems. Neither of them are particularly great for workers, but capitalism was much more productive than feudalism.
I want to give you an opportunity to examine like the business model that sort of Uber has ushered in, because there's so many other companies that are Uberifying whatever their vertical or whatever their market niche is. I mean, because we talked about Facebook, we talked about Google, and it seems like slightly a different type of business, but it kind of follows the rules that you lay out in this book of how these platforms decay.
Yeah, so, Google lost $31 billion over 13 years, mostly Saudi royal money. They got it from a venture capital fund called SoftBank that's run by Masayoshi Son. That's the same people who gave us WeWork, and they gave us, now they're backing OpenAI. So the Saudis subsidize 41 cents out of every dollar of all of our taxi rides for more than a decade. All the other cab companies go under. We have a lost decade in transit. And as a result, when Uber starts to raise prices, and they more than doubled them now, and when they start to cut wages, and they've more than halved them now, we're often without any other alternatives. They're able to make a lot of money from this. They're redeeming those discounts they offered in the early days. Uber has really digital, high-tech ways of changing the wages and prices that they pay and offer. So this is something called algorithmic wage discrimination. It comes from a legal scholar called Veena Dubal. And what Uber does is periodically offers drivers a slightly lowball offer, a little less per mile, a little less per minute. And when the driver takes that, if they take the bait, then the offer goes down again a little while later, and it goes down again a little while after that. The idea here is to sort of, in the manner of boiling a frog, to get that driver to abandon all the things that used to let them be picky about which Uber rides they would take. And as a result, you have the steady erosion of these wages. Now, that's something that's spread to other fields where you have contractors. Uber misclassifies its employees as contractors and can get away with paying them different wages for the same work. That's also true in fields like nursing, where hospitals preferentially hire nurses as contractors, not as staff. It's how they do union avoidance. And it used to be that if you were hiring a contract nurse for the day, you do it with a staffing agency, and that would be someone local. These days, there's 4 giant apps, each of which bills itself as Uber for nursing. And because we haven't had a new privacy law since 1988, these apps, before they offer nurses a shift, can go to a data broker and find out how much credit card debt the nurse has. And the more credit card debt that nurse is carrying, the lower the wage they are offered. They are imputing financial desperation and charging them a premium as a result. So this Uberization is spreading to other labor markets, and it is connected to a lack of competition, a lack of regulation, the unique characteristics of digital, and the fact that IP law stops nurses from twiddling back, from changing the way this stuff works. If you're a nurse or an Uber driver or someone else who's being paid with an app, you could, in the absence of the IP laws that stop you from buying an app that intervenes, you could get an app that says things like, okay, all the nurses in this town are going to refuse shifts below a certain wage, or all the drivers in this town are going to refuse rides below a certain wage. And it can calculate in an instant how much you're being paid by the mile and by the minute, which is something that can be really hard to do. If you're a person, you've got 10 seconds to decide whether you're going to take a ride. There are so many ways that people could push back with technology. They've all been taken off the table. And so what we have is infinite flexibility in technology to exploit and harm you, and zero flexibility in technology to defend yourself from exploitation and harm.
So let's pivot a bit to kind of what does your vision of a future look like, of a good internet? What are the kinds of interventions that we would need to do to build that? I mean, because I think a lot of times the onus gets thrust back upon us. Oh, well, if you just vote with your dollars, if you just change your behavior, whatever. Well, as you described, look, a lot of times we don't really have that much of a choice. But on the policy front, are there things that we can do to try to regain some of this control?
I believe in systemic changes. And you asked about which policies would make a difference. Well, privacy law would sure go a long way. There are lots of different people who are angry about the privacy situation in America. And if we could get them all to start pulling in the same direction, boy, could we ever make a difference, right? And the answer to this is a federal privacy law with a private right of action. And we are long overdue for it. That would be a very big one. And I think it's a relatively easy lift. The other stuff's a little harder. One thing that I go into some detail on in the book is how to think about a policy that is administrable, right? So we can imagine lots of things we don't want companies to do, but figuring out whether they're following those rules is really hard. If we say, okay, we have to stop people from harassing people and allowing hate speech. Well, you have to agree on what hate speech is. You have to investigate something that someone has called hate speech and see whether it is hate speech. You have to decide whether the company did what it could to stop it. This is like a multi-year process for something that happens 100 times a minute on a platform like Facebook. And so it's just not a great answer. Meanwhile, if you ask yourself, why do people on Facebook who are bombarded with hate speech and harassment stay on Facebook? Well, the answer is that they don't want to leave their friends, right? And so those people stay. So why don't we make it easier for them to leave? Mark Zuckerberg gave you a scraper that would let you leave MySpace, but still see the messages for you on MySpace. We could reverse engineer apps to do that. We could use scrapers to do it. And we could also mandate, through policy that firms do it. So we could make it so that if you left Twitter or Facebook and went to Blue Sky or Mastodon, that you could see the things people were posting for you on the platform you used to belong to, and they could see the things that you posted in reply. And that would mean that if the company didn't treat you well, you could leave. That is how you vote with your feet and vote with your wallet. But in order to do it, we need policy that makes it possible. As to how you get involved in policy, well, I mentioned a few times that I work for this digital rights nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And these are grassroots groups that work on everything from abortion privacy and limiting the use of digital tools in ICE raids to limiting facial recognition to demanding that public procurements be of tools and software that can be independently repaired and audited. And there's a lot of room to do work even under this federal administration at the state and local level.
Yeah. I did want to ask, look, a company like Uber or Google, they'll hear what you have to say maybe, and they say, look, this is the free market. We have built a product that's successful enough that people with their own power have chosen the costs and the benefits, and they're coming to us and they're doing business with us because we provide them a service that's worth it. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think if that were the case, it would be great, but that's not the case. I mean, if you want to choose someone else's app store for the iPhone, you have to commit a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. If these guys want to be creatures of the free market, then they should stop using state intervention to prevent new market entry and to prevent end users from getting a better deal, from installing privacy blockers in their apps and so on. The rules against reverse engineering have been enormously beneficial to these companies that make proprietary platforms like our cell phones. You know, if you're a web user, chances are you've installed an ad blocker. 51% of web users has installed an ad blocker. It's the biggest consumer boycott in human history. No one's ever installed an ad blocker for an app, because to reverse engineer the proprietary platform that the app comes along is a felony under Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998, and it carries a sentence of a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense. And so if they want to be creatures of the free market, well, then let them give up the power to invoke the state to prevent people from deciding how their own property works. I'm not the world's biggest advocate for markets as the best way to organize everything, but the one thing that people who believe in markets should believe in is that private property is sacrosanct. And when you buy your phone, the fact that it would make Tim Cook sad if you use someone else's store is his problem, not your problem.
The book is called Identification: Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. Author Cory Doctorow, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Hari. It was a real pleasure to be on.
Now, the Trump administration's immigration crackdown is just one example of the whirlwind changes in Washington this year, from aid and foreign policy to trade and beyond. Trump has upended U.S. doctrine, transforming institutions and redefining America's place in the world. Staff writer at The New Yorker, Susan Glasser, joins Michelle Martin to cut through the noise and identify the defining themes of the past 10 months.
Thanks, Paula. Susan Glasser, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
So obviously we've called you because you've followed, politics and policy in Washington and around the world for many, many years. What about this year stands out to you? And I know it's hard to pick because there have been so many consequential events this year, one after another. But when you just think about the year on the whole, what stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, if the goal was to overwhelm, let's just say they're succeeding and then some. If anything, the year has been characterized by a level of disruption and even at times destruction in Washington that is something that I suspect we'll all be looking back to for a long, long time.
I'm thinking about, the first part of the year is that I don't even know what to call it. It's not an agency, this kind of ad hoc group led by Elon Musk, whose main project seemed to be to destroy, humanitarian aid around the world, as well as, federal agencies. And then, of course, the tariff policy, the mass pardoning of January 6th defendants on Inauguration Day, these moves to reshape the federal bureaucracy, particularly with an eye to things that have been disturbing to conservatives for years, like the Department of Education and things of that sort. Is there anything that constitutes a through line through all of that?
Yeah, that is, I think, important for us to try to reckon with. And as I think of it, in some ways, Trump 1.0, you could say, was the completion of what Trump's son-in-law called the hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And that was accomplished really, by a couple years into Trump's term, I would say, as figures like John McCain left the scene and were replaced by enablers or, supporters of Trump and his MAGA movement. I would say, if that was 1.0, Trump 2.0 is the hostile takeover of Washington and the turning of the executive branch of the U.S. federal government into an extraordinary personal platform for the expanded powers and reach or overreach, as the case may be, of one man. This is something that, again, I think we'll be studying for many decades to come, which is the incredible aggregation of power in the form of one man in the Oval Office, and the idea that the Congress has largely stepped aside, including even abdicating many of its constitutionally assigned functions. There was a moment recently that was so telling when President Trump said, I feel like I'm the Speaker of the House as well as the President too. And in some ways you can't argue with that. So again, this incredible accretion of personalized executive power in the presidency. We don't know yet to what extent, if at all, this Trump appointed conservative majority in the Supreme Court may yet act to constrain him. We don't know yet whether the voters ultimately will rebuke this and restrain it or roll it back in the midterm elections. But for now,
2025 is the year that America got a different kind of presidency.
Of all the things that we're thinking about here, when you think about the year, there are things that are really visible inside Washington. There are things that are visible outside of Washington. What are the things you think that might be most visible outside of Washington?
He said that he was going to be the president who was going to bring back the economy, the president who was going to stop inflation, the president who was going to restore kind of the way things were before the COVID pandemic disrupted the U.S. and the world. And that, I think, is where it's pretty remarkable that he's lost the very people, arguably, who brought him back to the presidency. Those kind of non-frequent voters, the independents, the young people who thought, okay, well, things aren't going well, and I'm really unhappy about the state of things in the economy. I'm unhappy about how much I have to pay. And here we are, not even a year later. And in fact, Americans are even more upset about the state of the economy than they were a year ago when they elected Donald Trump to fix it. And, you know, he promised a lot of things that he was going to do on day one. He promised he was going to settle the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't done that. But most importantly, from the point of view, I think, of the American electorate, he promised that he was going to bring prices down on day one of his second presidency and restore the economy. Instead, where we are is we have essentially the same level of inflation now that we did a year ago when Donald Trump was campaigning against the Joe Biden economy. He said that 3% inflation at that time was literally like the worst inflation in the history of the world, which of course it wasn't. And it wasn't even the worst inflation in modern times in the United States. But nonetheless, Donald Trump campaigned against that level of inflation. A year later, we have 3% inflation, essentially the exact same numbers that we did on the eve of the election. And now Donald Trump is calling this an affordability crisis that's a Democratic hoax that's just not true. The electorate needs to suck it up and get over it. Very similar in some ways to the level of denial that we saw from the former President Biden.
Let's talk about immigration. His polls have declined, maybe not with his core supporters because he's got a core group of supporters who seem to support him no matter what. But it does seem that there are a lot of people who are disturbed by the way his immigration policy is unfolding. You know, they're seeing these images of people, women being dragged from their cars. They're seeing parents being arrested in front of their kids when they drop them off. And how do you think this is playing? How do you assess how this is going?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It was something not only that Trump campaigned on, but was very much a mobilizing factor for his core supporters. And I remember very vividly being at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. And when he said mass deportation now, there were pre-printed signs. And it was one of the only things, aside from the mention of his name itself, that audience really went crazy for. They were absolutely stirred up and rallied by that. And they held up the mass deportation now signs. The other issue, by the way, that really seemed to energize that core group of supporters, it was any mention of like men playing women's sports or, you know, trans issues. Those were the two things that I think really crystallized the culture war as it played out in the 2024 campaign. So flash forward, he's executing on that. As you said, we're now living in this world of these kind of horrible shock videos, right? Do you avert your gaze? Do you feel that you need to look at them because it's what's happening in our country right now? I mean, it's a painful aspect of kind of the visual backdrop, if you will, to the Trump 2.0 presidency. You also mentioned Trump's declining poll numbers. And this, I think, is very significant. Again, as I'm looking for differences between the first term and the second term, Donald Trump in the first term was a very unpopular president. He was a historically unpopular president, the most unpopular since public polling was taken, consistently. What's different is that back in the first term, Trump was generally getting pretty good marks on things like the economy, even where he was seen as personally polarizing or unpleasant to voters. So they gave him more credit for at least delivering on the economy in some ways, even if they didn't like what kind of public persona he had and the polarization. Now, interestingly enough, Donald Trump is even more underwater in the polls on things like the economy than he is overall in his negative approval ratings. Gallup just found that Trump had the lowest numbers of his 2 presidencies, including a 60% disapproval rating, but even more disapproval on the economy, even on immigration, where broadly speaking, even many Democrats and independents had supported the idea of closing the border. Or making it less permeable. I think a lot of Democrats believe their own party screwed up and that Joe Biden screwed up as president, to be blunt, in sort of allowing out of control illegal migration into the country. And so while there was a residual support in the public, it's these tactics that you mentioned, Michelle, I think, that have really begun to cause a backlash. The idea that it's not just the criminal illegal migrants that Donald Trump initially told us that he was going to go after, but that it's reaching into, essentially peaceful civil society in ways that people do not support and did not expect.
The other interesting thing that's happened this week that is related to immigration is the national security strategy was released, and it cites immigration to Europe as a problem. The way it was described as, what is it, the erasure of civilization due to immigration. How do you understand that, and what does this tell us about Trump's kind of view of the relationship that he thinks the United States should have with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that is a pretty radical document. It's a pretty disruptive document. It has a worldview that is very, very incompatible with the worldviews of any modern president, whether Democrat or Republican. It essentially abdicates and sort of says we're moving on from the idea of the United States as this global superpower and guarantor of the liberal order. I'm old enough to remember when American presidents used to speak of exporting democracy to the world. Donald Trump is now talking about exporting right-wing racism to Europe, which is really something remarkable. As you might expect, this has occasioned an incredible amount of both backlash and, I think, really existential level soul searching among European leaders, because really, not just since the end of the Cold War, but since the end of World War II, it's this partnership between the United States and Western Europe that has been the anchor of global security in many ways. And what Donald Trump is saying is that, actually in my first term, I talked about pay more for the security. Now I'm saying, yeah, I'm not really in on the deal. And it tells you in many ways much of what you need to know, that the people who have reacted favorably to the new national security strategy of the United States of America is the Kremlin. And you had both the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, and the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, welcoming this national security strategy with open arms, saying that it was explicitly echoing what Russia itself has said about security. It talks about, ending a world in which NATO is continuing to expand. It talks about the U.S. essentially destabilizing the governments that it doesn't like of many of its Western European allies and working from within those countries to depose those leaders. I mean, that's just a remarkable statement. It led one senior European I spoke with this week to say, my concern isn't so much anymore that the United States is not on this, not working to help Ukraine and Europe, but that the United States is now actively switching sides. And that's number one. Number two, I think this is very important, is that Trump in his campaign and in his first year of his presidency now has advanced a pretty radical notion of national security in which the U.S. basically is focused mostly on the Western Hemisphere, kind of a spheres of influence, almost a 19th century view of carving up the world with the other powers like Russia and China, but also that it should operate with impunity, basically, within the Western Hemisphere, and that they're defining national security threats as coming from, quote, the enemy within. That's something Trump said on the campaign trail. It's something that he repeated, and Pete Hegseth, his Secretary of Defense, repeated in that remarkable convening of America's general officers in Quantico. He basically said we should use the U.S. military on the streets of our own cities, and that it's actually domestic disturbances that pose a national security threat. And as you know, of course, he's kind of started to follow through on that by deploying troops to American cities on made up pretexts of crime waves and political disturbances that don't really exist, and over the objections of those cities' elected leadership. So it's not just about words anymore, Michelle. I think that's the key point.
The president's, how can we put this, seems to be very committed to enriching himself, if I can put it that way, in this current administration. I mean, in his first term in office, he said that he'd put his holdings into a blind trust. But in this administration, in this current term, there doesn't seem to be much concern about appearances of conflicts. It doesn't seem to be much concern about whether his policies dovetail particularly nicely with his own personal financial interests. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought this up because I believe that it is very important. The levels of self-enrichment and the mobilization of the U.S. presidency as a tool for the enrichment of Donald Trump and his family is a really remarkable aspect of the second term. And again, the scale and scope of that enrichment. We are talking billions of dollars that are coming into the pockets of the Trump family and those in his inner circle.
And how is that working? How is that happening? And is that visible to the public? Is that the kind of thing that the public can see?
Yeah,
if they're interested.
Yeah, there's been incredible investigative reporting that has produced some really eye-popping examples. For example, Donald Trump's sons and Steve Witkoff's sons, Witkoff being his personal golfing buddy, real estate developer, turned peace envoy both to the Middle East and Russia. At the same time, the Trump family and the Witkoff family are doing business with the Arab Gulf Emirates at the same time that they're negotiating major international accords and actually twinning these things so that Trump and his family are talking about deals, billions of dollars invested in a new crypto company run by the Trump kids and the Witkoff kids. At the same time, Trump and Witkoff were in the Middle East for the first foreign visit of Donald Trump's second term. That's one example of many. There are new Trump real estate developments in countries around the world, Trump branded real estate developments in countries around the world that have major business with the Trump administration. He hosted the people who gave money to a Trump crypto enterprise for dinner at his club outside Washington, D.C., and then brought them in for a personal tour of the White House. So, again, it's the commingling that is really remarkable. We know, for example, that the Saudi government entities basically gave $2 billion in seed money to Jared Kushner's new investment fund at the end of Trump's first term. Well, did all that money come from Saudi Arabia? Maybe it's coming from other foreign entities. The answer is that we don't know.
Susan Glasser, thank you so much for talking with us again.
Great to be with you. Thank you.